Greetings, everybody. So, 10 years ago, thousands of Arab citizens took to the streets to demand of their governments an end to corruption, an end to human rights abuses, and to be consequential in the decisions of their leaders. They inaugurated a season of change that we have now come to call the Arab Spring. And for anybody who was sentient during that period, it is difficult to exaggerate what a feeling of hope we had for an Arab future that was different from the grim, cramped, authoritarian Arab past. Today, of course, the dreams that characterized that period remain unfulfilled. If you survey the political regimes of the region, you will see that most today are, as they were on the eve of the Arab Spring, undemocratic. Only one of the 22 countries of the Arab League is what we would call a liberal democracy, and that's tiny Tunisia, a country of about 11 million people. And even that democratic experiment totters in the face of a longstanding economic crisis and broad concerns about a diminishing of order, prosperity, etc. If you look at countries like Libya, Yemen, Syria, you see that they are mired in bloodshed and civil war that is so heinous as to make the pre-Arab Spring authoritarian periods look like something of a golden age. And then when you cast your gaze to the Arab world's largest country, Egypt, a country now of 100 million people, it's difficult to conclude that anything other than that country is more autocratic now than it has ever been in the past. On top of all of this, there is a certain assuredness to the region's autocrats, where in the pre-Arab Spring period, autocracy was something perhaps to be covered for, apologized for. Even today, it is something that in some corners of the region is actually celebrated and touted as the way forward for the region. There is a sense now that we haven't had before that democracy just can't deliver the goods, that movements for democracy only bring in their wake chaos, disorder, and suffering. So, was the Arab Spring, given this grim litany, a failure? Today, we have with us one of the most qualified people on our planet to help us grapple with this question, and that person is Michael Hanna. Michael is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and like myself, he's an Egyptian, which is to say he is a man of intelligence and discernment. It also, I'm going to get to his formal bio in a second, but I can't resist saying, because he's an Egyptian, it also means that he's a fan of the Liverpool Football Club. But unlike most of us who only heard of Liverpool starting in 2017 when Mo Salah joined that club, Michael has been a fan of Liverpool since birth because he was actually born in that city before Mo Salah was a gleam in Jurgen Klopp's eye. Broadly speaking, Michael Hanna is a scholar of international security, international law, and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and in the Muslim majority world. He's the co-author and co-editor of several important works on the region, two of which bear mentioning today. One is Arab Politics Beyond the Uprisings, Experiments in an Era of Resurgent Authoritarianism, which came out with the Century Foundation in 2017. And the other is Citizenship and Its Discontents, The Struggle for Rights, Pluralism, and Inclusion in the Middle East, which came out in 2019, both of which he co-edited with Thanasi Kambanis. He has also published very widely on U.S. foreign policy, the Arab Spring, Egyptian politics, in places such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the New Republic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. He appears on television regularly, including on PBS and the BBC and National Public Radio. And he is without doubt one of the most sober, insightful, and morally consistent observers of the region working today. Before he joined the Century Foundation and became one of our most important voices on Middle East affairs, he spent many years as a corporate lawyer at the White Shoe New York law firm of Cleary Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton. He's got a law degree from the New York University School of Law. He's also been a Fulbright scholar at Cairo University, in addition to many other accolades and awards. Mr. Hanna is going to speak for about 30 minutes on the broad theme of where are we now, 10 years after the onset, and what would you say, Michael, 7 years after the end of the Arab Spring, if in fact the Arab Spring did end. And then he and I will have a little bit of back and forth. I'll ask him a few questions, and then I will open it up to the audience. Now, if at any point you have a question that you would like me to ask on your behalf, I encourage you to ask that in the chat or to message me directly. And of course, you will have the opportunity to put your question directly to Mr. Hanna once his talk has ended. With that, let me turn it over to Michael Wahid Hanna. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Tarek. It's really an honor to be with you today. It's a lot of pressure after that intro. Happy to have Liverpool Football Club worked into the intro in some form or fashion. That's different and quite nice. I'm gonna talk both. Well, I'm gonna talk in some ways backward-looking, present-looking, and forward-looking. I've thought a lot about the past 10 years in recent months for obvious reasons. And, you know, most of the conclusions are not happy ones. Like Tarek mentioned, the events of 10 plus years ago were extraordinary. You know, I think it is very unlikely that I will personally ever experience something like that again. It was a moment of transformational potential. And I think we'll probably get to this again. We'll talk about it some more. I don't think these were events that were foreordained to failure. They failed in our present moment for a variety of reasons, some of which were structural, but many having to do with the decisions of people and the actions of institutions. Those things didn't have to happen. And I think that's you know, something I've been keen to talk about for many years now. When I arrived in Cairo in early February, as soon as the mass mobilization started, it seemed to me like the place to be would be in Cairo to see firsthand what was going on. So personally, this was a kind of a truly remarkable moment when one had the sense of living history. And it was remarkable to have Egypt at the center of what was happening in the world. All eyes were on Egypt. Obviously, Tahrir Square emerged as this iconic forum. You know, the protests were much broader than Tahrir Square. They were in many cities, Alexandria, the Delta, and otherwise. But you know, for a moment, it seemed like many things were possible. I remember late one night, my maternal grandparents' home, and the place where I go when I'm in Egypt is quite close to Tahrir. It's close to a place called Abu Tarek that sells kushari and is quite famous. But in any event, I was there late one night with the late Anthony Shadid, a dear friend, and he marveled at that time. It was quite wistfully, and he said, you know, this is the first good story I've ever covered. He'd been a reporter in the region since the 90s and had seen a lot, including the Iraq War. And this was the first time that he thought that something quite remarkable and good was happening in the Middle East. And of course, I shared those sentiments at the time. And I still do, because again, I do think this was a transformational opening. And we can talk about the reasons for what I will call its failure. I know people are hesitant to say those words, but I think we can call it a failure. One that is still unresolved in some ways, maybe is continuing, but from our perspective now, it's hard to judge the state of the region in any other way. 2011 was a surprise for me. I think it has shaped the way that I understand prediction and what I think is its limited capacity. If we look at the risk factors for instability, the possibilities for protests, they existed in the region for many, many years, decades perhaps. And the precise combination of reasons is too complex, I think, to decipher why things happen when. There are too many individual human decisions at play. But what we can say is that this was a cascade moment. And I think that bespeaks something quite unique about the Arab world. So we can now, in hindsight, see and understand the antecedents to what happened. Things like the mass mobilization that occurred around the Second Intifada, protests against the Iraq War. You had Syrian Kurdish restiveness in the mid 2000s. The fallout from the invasion of Iraq, things like the Kafaya movement, Khalid Said in Egypt. So you see all of these things that one can make sense looking backward. But at the time, I had no sense that Egypt was on the cusp of an uprising. I remember in the summer of 2010, I was sitting with one of the senior leaders of the Kafaya movement, and Egypt was in the grips at that point in time of concern about succession. And he said, at this point, I think the only thing that can save us from Gamal Mubarak is the military. And of course, I think he didn't quite realize just how right he would be shortly thereafter. But someone who was involved in these efforts on the ground clearly also had no sense of what was getting ready to happen. I mentioned that it was a cascade moment, and what do I mean by that? I mean that there was real energy and learning in a shared media space. There is no way to understand Egypt without first Tunisia, and of course, after Egypt being the largest country in the region, you had this cascade event flowing into Libya, into Syria, into Bahrain, into Yemen. This is reflective of the fact that there continues to exist a kind of Arab political imagination. Not the kind of programmatic Arab nationalism of the 50s and 60s, of course, when the region saw its political fate as potentially fused, but clearly a kind of sense of the region as existing as not a coherent whole, but as a shared space in which political events in one country were fueling mobilization in others. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. I do think the Arab region functions perhaps differently than other regions in that way. I don't think these uprisings were doomed to failure. And this is something that Tarek and I have talked about together. I've written about. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, because it centers the agency of the people in the region. And I'll get to this as well when I talk about the role of the US, because I think at times it has been overstated in terms of the dispositive effect on events on the ground. But I think decision-making and the actions of institutions, Tunisia doesn't have to be what it is today. And it is such because individuals and institutions took decisions at various points in time. We can talk about maybe later on the kind of structural reasons why Tunisia is quite different than Egypt. Obviously, scale is an important one. But Tunisia could have ended up in a much more disastrous situation than the kind of suboptimal, one could say arguably democratic outcome that it continues with at the moment. And I mentioned failure. I think that's a fair description. Obviously, if you are Sudanese, if you are Algerian, more recently we've had protests in Iraq and Lebanon, perhaps you would say that's premature and is overlooking the kinds of political vitality that exist in some parts of the region. But I think one can definitively say that for those people who took to the streets in Cairo, say in January 2011, and who were in Tahrir on February 11th when they heard the announcement that Hosni Mubarak was stepping down, when we think about what their aspirations were for the future at that moment and compare it with our present, I think failure is a very fair way to describe where Egypt is and where much of the region is at the moment. I don't mean that to be definitive in the sense that that the after effects of these movements and the uprisings themselves cannot have positive effect into the future. But the reality at the moment is a grim one in many places. And as Tarek mentioned, we have many examples of a kind of resurgent authoritarianism that in the case of a place like Egypt is unparalleled in its history, even during the Nasser era. And of course, that's not even to mention the kinds of armed conflict that exist in places like Syria, Libya, and Yemen. And I will point to those examples because as much as the cascade effect was dependent on regional examples and regional learning and regional media, the deterrent effect of these failures has had a huge influence in deterring political behavior and really cementing the authoritarian present. And what do I mean by that? Shortly after the coup in Egypt, as the Sisi regime was beginning to consolidate, one of the messages of the regime at the time was, and in the ensuing years this would be echoed many times over, was if not for that moment, Egypt could have gone the way of Syria. It could have gone the way of Libya. It could have gone the way of Yemen. And for many people, this struck as kind of crude propaganda. And of course, it was a kind of crude propaganda. But for many people in the region, there was real resonance there because they saw danger in political change. And I think one point that is important when we think about these events, and to think about things like regime change more broadly, is that political ruptures are dangerous. They are fraught. They oftentimes end in disaster. And of course, we celebrate them. There's a kind of romantic sense about what it means for citizens who have been repressed to take to the streets to demand their rights and to depose despots, and in this case, it was many times over. And of course, at the time, I celebrated these events without a doubt. I saw in them real opportunity and hope. But they are dangerous. Political ruptures, even in the best case conditions, can potentially lead to the outcomes that we've seen. And in the worst case, that has led to civil conflict, sectarian war, And in a case like Syria, the human costs are incalculable. And of course, for people throughout the region looking at the Syrian civil war and its aftermath, almost 10 years later, it's not surprising in many cases that people become apathetic about politics, resigned from political life, and resistant to the possibility of political change. These are pretty basic human instincts for a region that has gone through the trauma that it has in recent years. I mentioned that I didn't think, and I still do not think that failure was inevitable. If we take a case like Egypt, I think individual decisions, the lack of leadership, made a huge difference. If I can talk about the specific case maybe when we're in our discussion, but I don't want to overlook structural factors, and some of the structural factors are purposeful. We see, and we've seen an acceleration of this since, but a real authoritarian trap. Resurgent authoritarianism in the region now has been keen to kill off the possibility of independent political life, independent civil society, all of the precursors to potential political vitality and political change. And of course, in doing so, it has demolished alternatives, and it has this form of authoritarianism has heightened the risks of political change. And of course, in many cases, the countries of the region are perhaps less prepared for political change than they were 10 years ago. It makes the stakes for political change even more fraught, even more dangerous, because the institutions don't exist to nurture and sustain political change, to have an independent political life. And that's by design. If we look at the Sisi regime and what they took as their chief lesson from the kind of near-death experience that they perceived 2011 to 2013 to be, it is that the pseudo-liberalization of the late Mubarak period, when there was a semi-free media, a controlled parliament, but one with actual political parties involved, is that in allowing this controlled opposition, they provided the building blocks for their own undoing. And the chief lesson that the regime learned was to crush any incipient movements in that direction, however inconsequential. And so in the years since, I think people have read the insanely repressive actions of the regime as insecurity and fear of what these organizations or activists or people or institutions mean for the regime, and I don't think that's correct. I think the point is one of zero tolerance, no green shoots, not allowing these kinds of movements any space to grow, because if you do, it could eventually lead to something much broader. And of course, what we see in these failures and what we see from the kind of authoritarian trap that that the region lives in now is the necessity of precisely what is not existent in the region today. And that is, the nurturing of institutions, the creation of a political culture, the growing of political parties. I remember one of my great frustrations in the actual period of potential transition, 2011 to 2013, was the view of American policymakers at very senior levels about what was happening in a place like Egypt, where there was understandable but overstated frustration with the non-Islamist parties in Cairo and Egypt more broadly. And I remember many conversations where I would say, you know, what we see today in Egypt is the kind of end stage of the Mubarak era. It does not necessarily presage the next 30 years of Egyptian politics. It seems crazy to imagine that political parties that didn't exist 6 months ago could effectively contest parliamentary elections on a nationwide basis a mere months after coming into existence. You know, time is important. Institution building is not the kind of thing that can happen overnight. And of course, this is wholly non-existent in the region at the moment. One could imagine a kind of phased process of reform that begins with municipal and local elections, things that hardly exist, of course, in the region at the moment. But it seems to me that if you have a political rupture in which political parties are contesting national stakes and they have very little experience with actual governance, it's not surprising then that these contests become infused with existential stakes. You have people who have no real sense of governance or how to do it. And of course, you know, that's a bad recipe. That's not going to produce happy outcomes, and that shouldn't be surprising to us. There are things that are quite obvious in terms of what would need to happen to produce independent political life and a sustainable political culture and the institutions that could nurture political change in the future. Obviously, we're far away from that. The rulers of the region are intent on, of course, doing quite the opposite of that. I'll touch on the United States and its role, particularly in the present. I think it's a mistake. There are various narratives out there about the kind of dispositive role that the United States played in the failures of the region. I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong in terms of looking at the uprisings themselves. Their initial success. If you want to center the United States, you are necessarily kind of erasing the kind of miraculous events that happened on the ground, that happened because of people mobilizing in their thousands and millions. You know, Hosni Mubarak was not deposed because of the United States. You know, there were institutional calculations, of course, by Egyptian institutions like the military, most prominently. But those were mostly driven by what was happening on the ground in Egypt and by their own self-interest, not the United States. And the United States in those early weeks and months was quite reactive, was chasing events as opposed to dictating events. You know, I think, again, it's important to remember that local agency of people and institutions in the region. And that brings me to an important theme that I think is, you know, quite useful to think about now, and that is the limited leverage that the United States can bring to bear. There are some that imagine that conditionality and very stringent conditionality can bring about different political outcomes in a place like Egypt. And I simply reject that premise. I think conditionality is a potentially useful tool for the United States, but not in the sense of bringing about political change, but thinking about American complicity in authoritarianism. I do not believe that things like military assistance are going to be a productive tool in terms of changing the trajectory of Egyptian political life or the politics of other countries in the region. I do, however, think that we have a lot to think about in terms of our security assistance, in terms of our complicity with authoritarianism. And that's something we can get into more if anybody is interested. Sudan, Algeria, up until, the pre-pandemic and even during the pandemic period, Lebanon and Iraq. The region is broad. It is not Egypt and Syria and Yemen. And I mean, it is, in some ways, it's hard to talk about a coherent Arab world. Maybe it doesn't make sense to do so. But there are these political experiments happening elsewhere. I think Sudan obviously has to be seen as the most promising of these potential political opportunities. And so I don't mean to be wholly pessimistic, but it is, of course, hard to view what has happened since the initial uprisings with anything but a fair bit of pessimism. Authoritarianism in the region has been adaptive. It benefits from fear and instability elsewhere in the region. It benefited, I think, clearly also by the kind of resurgence of authoritarianism and demagogic populism on a kind of global level. That could obviously be seen during the Trump years. One hopes that there'll be a kind of shift. And of course, we've seen shifts in the atmospherics of these relationships in the United States. But it's too soon to know if that will have any bearing on actual policy. And lastly, I just want to say that the authoritarianism in the region has real constituencies. It has been a kind of popular trope to suggest that the authoritarians of the region are simply born of repression, and of course they require repression to survive. But it is not just repression. The Sisi regime, the Assad regime, these regimes have popular constituencies. Some of that is built on fear, the lack of perceived alternatives. But there are other constituencies that believe fervently in the necessity of this kind of governance in the face of regional instability. And so it's important not to lose sight of that fact because these regimes have real supporters, despite their quite poor record in delivering human security and good governance, of course. But it is not simply a kind of white hats and black hats version of history in which these autocratic regimes stand athwart progress that all their people are yearning for. These are divided societies. And of course, that highlights the real danger of political change and political ruptures in these kinds of places because people don't agree on the future. And we saw this quite clearly during discussions about constitutional arrangements. These are divided societies, and in such settings, all politics assumes existential stakes. I remember a conversation with Al-Akhtar al-Ibrahimi at one point in 2012 in Cairo. He was getting ready to go see Bashar al-Assad when he was serving as the UN Special Envoy for Syria. But he was in Cairo on the way, and he wondered at the time whether actually jumping straight to constitutional transitions made sense for these settings, whether a kind of 5-year or 2-year interim period of transition was necessary to cool emotions, to diminish the stakes. And his fear was, and I think rightly so, that if you tip transitions immediately into the biggest questions that implicate identity and a sense of national destiny, that you will trigger all of the most reactionary and potentially damaging impulses of these kinds of unstable settings, and creating the kind of zero-sum stakes that came to dominate politics in places like Egypt and elsewhere. Um, and I think obviously that's correct. I don't know how to, it's very difficult to create a process through which to effectuate those kinds of ideas. But it points to something, again, quite important about these divided societies in the face of transformational political moments. You know, it's quite dangerous, um, and it's not surprising that in many of these cases, these transitions and attempts at creating a better political future failed. I'll stop there, and we can chat further.
Great. Thank you for that, Michael. You know, you put a lot of really important, interesting, and sobering ideas on the table. And so I kind of want to just abuse my position a little bit, ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And, you know, if I were to summarize your remarks, you know, the major theme is your belief that the Arab Spring could have turned out differently, and that what we observe today, the wreckage of the Arab Spring, was engineered after a fashion by the different actors in these different countries who over time consistently just made the wrong decisions. And so you know, you're Egyptian, I'm Egyptian, 1 in 4 Arabs is Egyptian. So I'm going to ask about Egypt, but this is really a question that I think we could ask of any of the countries. You know, if you look at that transition in Egypt, is there a moment where you first thought to yourself, this is going the wrong way?
Yeah. So, you know, I think I place blame at different junctures on different actors, seeing as who had the kind of predominant political power. I had no expectations at any point during the transition or thereafter that the military was going to be a democratizing force. So obviously one can say if the Egyptian military had acted differently, you know, clearly things would have been quite different. In June/July of 2013, if the military had decided to try to broker an accord or try to mediate a kind of dispute settlement mechanism at a time of political crisis, you know, Egypt's civilian-led political order might have lived on for another day. But that would be expecting the military to act different than the Egyptian military thinks and acts. And so, you know, I'm loath to try to ascribe, you know, potential different decision making on the part of the military. Although it is easy to imagine a different scenario. When Sisi took over after Tantawi, there was a sense that that the SCAF period of interim military rule in the early part of the transition prior to the presidential elections was a bruising one for the military, that they didn't like. This is what we heard, and this is what military leaders said at the time, that they didn't like being front and center, that it tarnished the image and reputation of the military, and that they wanted to take a step back. And in some ways, that could have been a much more pragmatic way to wield power from the background, let the civilians take the heat, exercise kind of veto power on national security decision making, while letting civilians try to corral this really quite difficult mess. They chose differently. But again, you know, the military is not a democratizing force in Egypt, and one shouldn't expect that. But if we look at the constellation of civilian political leaders, I think that's where we get at potential alternative scenarios. So early on, the military didn't quite understand what was happening in the streets in Egypt. They believed that it was a Muslim Brotherhood-led mobilization. They didn't understand what was happening in Egyptian society. And they believed that if they negotiated with the Brotherhood and they both sort of glommed onto the idea of early elections, then in doing so, they would neutralize the threat of mass mobilization and they would get the country back to normal. And of course, that's what they sought out. and the brothers were very eager to engage with the military at a very early stage, even during the 18 days, in fact. Um, much to the surprise of the military, the mobilization continued because it was not just the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a much broader constellation of forces that were part of the mobilization. I do think that that was a kind of fateful decision, both by the military and by the brothers. I think the military was off balance, didn't quite understand what was going on. When the civilian forces were arrayed in a kind of uniform fashion against the wishes of the military, we saw concessions from the military. I think that was the fatal flaw, this tactical alliance that was able to push forward the mobilization of Islamists, non-Islamists, leftists, labor, was quite potent, maybe more potent than people realized, but they didn't agree on anything. And so you saw kind of meaningless, hollow slogans, like a civil state, Dawla Madaniyya, which was a kind of lowest common denominator slogan that they could all agree on, but didn't mean anything. I mean, for the brothers, it meant that, this wasn't going to be a theocratic state. Okay, that's fine. That's not anything that they aspire to directly. It's not a secular state. It was a civil state, just meant, a state not ruled by the military. But quite hollow in terms of what it meant in terms of binding these groups together. And so this tactical alliance proved very flimsy. It was teetering even during the 18 days, and it came apart thereafter. And it allowed the military to triangulate between the non-Islamist forces, quite fearful of these ascendant Islamists who were gaining in the various elections that happened. And these non-Islamist forces then began to look to the military as their potential shield. We saw this with the Sinmi document, which was the non-Islamist forces trying to create parameters for discussions about the constitutional transition. And of course, the military sought to fragment these forces. They were happy to talk in one setting with the Islamists, and another setting with the non-Islamists. And one last point, of course, is that as opposed to Tunisia, the Salafists took on a massive role in the early part of the transition, and of course had a big role in dragging the Brotherhood to its right, to try to protect its Islamist flank. And of course, it brought out the worst in the brothers, and with an effective supermajority in parliament with the Salafis, it created really pernicious dynamics, and the only compromise the brothers were interested in during the transition was with the right, and they were more than happy to jettison the non-Islamist forces that they had come out to meet in the streets, that it was the only way to depose Mubarak, and I think probably the only way to have put forward a kind of credible, coherent, civilian-led transition.
So Mike, I mean, and I promise I will get to questions from the audience momentarily, but I just want to sharpen this point a little bit. An alternative hypothesis could be that all of these rococo details that you are recounting can all be explained with reference to a very basic fact about Egyptian society, and you could make a similar argument about many other Arab countries that couldn't get democratic transitions off the ground. And frankly, you could even make the argument about Sudan, whose democratic transition you would have to be skeptical of if you believe that, one might argue in the case of Egypt, look, in order for you to get democracy, you need to have a complex society with an array of forces that can credibly compete for power, such that none of these forces can assert its will over any of the others. There's a famous quote by Walter Lippmann that I I've been enamored of for decades. And he says basically, for democracy, for freedom to persist, you need to have a relatively even balance of power between government and opposition, so that government can't ride roughshod over everybody, and so that the opposition won't just be revolutionary and irreconcilable. And what you had in Egypt, because it is a fairly underdeveloped, non-industrialized society, is you had basically very weak political parties aside from the Islamists. Now, you might say part of the reason political parties are weak is because of what Mubarak did. Fine, I'll stipulate that. But the result is you had a very weak political landscape, such that, look, who are the only forces that can credibly claim power? It's one of two fundamentally autocratic forces. It's the military or the Islamists. And that's basically what you had in Egypt, is a competition between these two autocratic forces. And the question was not whether democracy was going to succeed. Democracy was always going to fail. It's just, what was your mode of failure going to be? Were you going to get an Islamist autocracy, or are you going to get a military autocracy? What's your response to that, very structural argument that emerges from this read of the raw materials of Egyptian politics?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, we'd be stupid to say that structural factors aren't part of this discussion.
No. Hold on. I just want to steelman the alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is not saying structural factors are a part of this discussion. That's you as a very intelligent, sober person. I'm trying to offer you the one that says, look, man, all this focus on this guy decided this, and Tantawi and blah, 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 and Sisi when he came, and none of that matters. This was foreordained because of the basic structure. It's not structure also matters. It's structure is the only thing that matters.
Sure. Well, so, I mean, what I would point to, obviously, the non-Islamist political forces were rudimentary in the organization, political party life in that sense. And the reasons why the MB look different than the other parties is a long discussion that I think really, harkens back to, I think, 67 and the Islamic revivalism that swept the region thereafter. But that's a tangent that's too long to follow at the moment. But let's look at the presidential elections of 2012. Ahmed Shafiq nearly won those elections, right? And that those happen at a time, at a kind of high water mark of Islamist political life in this transitory period. And it's very closely contested. And if we look at the first round, and if you tally up the results of Ahmed Shafiq, Amr Musa, and Abdel Min'am Abdel Futuh, who a former brother, but who ran as a non-brother, that's a majority of the population.
But hold on.
Yeah.
Abdel Min'am Abdel Futuh was the candidate of, or supported rather, by the Salafi party.
Some of them, not all.
Well, I mean, the formal party, Hizb an-Nur, the big party, endorsed him. But remember also, Hazm Salah Abu Ismail was not allowed to run. The Muslim Brotherhood's first choice candidate was not allowed to run. So, the argument you're making is we can look at the results of the presidential election. Mohammed Morsi only gets about a quarter of the vote in the first round. And we can read from that there's a majority that didn't want it. But
it doesn't have to be a majority, but only to say that at the high point of Islamist political power during the transition, and potential, popularity at a time when they haven't governed, they don't have a kind of lock on Egyptian popular support. And it's one of the interesting things that happens during the transition is the Brotherhood misreading of their popular support. They assumed, I think wrongly, and this comes through in conversations I had with senior Brotherhood leaders throughout, sort of up until the coup, just about, where their sense was that what is the griping of these silly cosmopolitan Cairo elites who are so out of touch with the country that they don't understand how popular we are. And of course, they were shocked by June 30th. And of course, June 30th was not totally organic. If the security service had wanted to stop it or not encourage it, they could have stopped it months prior. But there was an organic element to that. There was a real a kind of vernacular that grew up in a kind of organic anti-Islamist opposition that grew up in Egypt. And the Brotherhood's popularity by the time we get to the coup in July of 2013 is quite different than what it was at the start of this process. And so, and of course, this is a time when they come to politics with huge advantages. All to say that I don't think that if we look at other transitions in Indonesia and other places, politics 10 years after the post-authoritarian moment, it looks quite different. And I assume that would have been the case if politics were given a chance to evolve over time in Egypt. And of course, the Brotherhood still has a kind of core constituency. It's not to say that they would have disappeared off the map, but they were seen as new. They were organized. They could field candidates all over the country, and so of course they had massive advantages in those early days.
Yeah. So I don't want to try the patience of our audience much longer, but I want to ask just one more question, because you've made a very eloquent and I think very compelling case for agency, for voluntarism, for the idea that actors acting in time can shape the fate of nations, that it's not all structure. And given your commitment, and I think well-justified commitment to that perspective, I'm having trouble understanding why you believe that the United States can't do much to influence the course of events in the region. So, I've also, in my more structuralist modes, will say like, oh, the US can't do anything, stay out of it. But that's because I believe, look, you're dealing with massive socioeconomic, historical forces. You can't deal. But if it's really just about like Sisi needs to make decision A instead of decision B, or Mohammed Morsi needs to make decision X instead of decision Y, then why can't US influence matter?
Well, I mean, we've seen, in the run-up to the coup, there are some who will say that the United States was giving mixed messages. Oh, fine, but clearly it was quite clear that the White House and the president himself didn't want to see a coup happen in Egypt, and there were admonitions, there were warnings, and after the coup happens, and the injection of $20 billion of aid from the Gulf, right? The other part of this story is that lots of other regional actors have agency as well. And so, we were warning, we don't want to see a coup happen. It might endanger our $1.3 billion of military assistance. Meanwhile, in parallel, prior to the coup, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has secured $20 billion in aid from the Gulf. And so, there are other forces acting with agency as well, in much more consequential ways. And even after the suspension, so military aid to Egypt isn't suspended on July 3rd. It's suspended in August following the massacre in Rabaa, which obviously was shocking. Was shocking to me. I was in Egypt at the time, and I think obviously shocking to those who are willing to see if there could be some kind of brokered accommodation, if there could be a kind of political agreement that could see this standoff resolved peacefully. But Egypt goes out and kills 1,000 people in one day. A truly shocking event, probably the largest single-day loss of life throughout the Arab uprisings, and the United States suspends portions of its military aid at that point, and it has no bearing. It has no impact on the ways in which at this point, this kind of military-led political order proceeds. Right? Sisi still hasn't ascended to the kind of structural forefront. Of course, he and the military are controlling events, but faced with what they have ginned up into a kind of existential struggle over the course of Egypt and its identity, hearkening back to decades-long suspicions about the brothers and Islamists and their transnational agendas. America and its desires and even its military assistance just doesn't cut it. And they are willing to roll the dice. They say, okay, we want this stuff. We want Apaches. We need these things. We want F-16s. We want Abrams tanks. And we think you're going to come around eventually. But in the meantime, we're not going to do anything differently. And they didn't. And they called the U.S. bluff, and they were right. And if the United States hadn't have backed down, I don't think much would have changed in terms of Egyptian political behavior. I don't think it is a meaningful tool to influence political life. And I just, I think security assistance is a poor way to do democracy promotion. It just hasn't ever worked that way. And I don't think we should think about it in those terms. I think, if you want to think about security assistance, think about it in terms of its effectiveness as a tool for military-to-military cooperation, in terms of counterterrorism, whatever you want, interoperability. There are ways in which we can gauge how important it is. And of course, military assistance to Egypt arises at a time of regional realignment following the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. It's not that it comes out of a vacuum, and it served important, political diplomatic ends in a previous era. I've argued elsewhere that I think it's a kind of relic of a different time and that needs to be re-examined. But the United States can't outpace Egypt in Egypt and its citizens' want for political change and democratization. It's never going to happen. And the tools that the United States has to do that are not sufficient to overcome, whether it be structural factors or the kind of material circumstances of Egypt and its citizens at present.
Great. Okay, let's open it up to our very patient audience. So again, if you have a question of Mr. Hanna, just put up your hand. And the first question I have is from Dr. Gary Seymour. So I'm going to unmute. You just need to unmute yourself. I think you should be able to do that. No? Let me just click ask to unmute. Is it not working? Yep, there we go.
Great. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Michael. It's been a really very interesting presentation. I think it's important to be able to say honestly that most of the Arab uprisings failed, but not to suggest that somehow the Arab countries are doomed to authoritarian governments. Now, Tarek has presented the structural argument for Egypt, that it was bound to end up with either a military dictatorship or an Islamist dictatorship. There's also a structural argument for civil war and chaos, that in those countries where you had a relatively weak sense of common identity and lots of latent divisions over tribe and region and religion and so forth, when you remove the authoritarian dictator in those countries, the result is civil war and chaos. Syria, Libya, Yemen, so forth. And the only way, the argument goes, the only way to run these countries, because they're so fragmented socially, is with an essentially authoritarian state, or if you look at Iraq or Lebanon, a totally dysfunctional democracy. So what's your response to that structural argument that would help to explain some of the other outcomes in the Arab Spring?
Yeah, again, so structural factors are important. We can't overlook them. But I do look to Tunisia, and of course it is a different society. But the outcome there, was not foreordained. Now, there were some structural factors that favored Tunisia over a place like Egypt. There is a kind of non-political military. There's no history of military intervention in politics like one had in Egypt. The Salafis didn't contest elections. There were some formulas for how the parliamentary elections produce results in terms of remainders that meant that Nahda's presence in the parliament was actually probably reduced in terms of what it actually represented in society. But then there were real differences in how Tunisia's civilians operated. I think some of that goes back to the years in exile and the kind of trust that built up among a wide spectrum of Tunisian political actors. And I remember discussions with Nahda leaders in the years after the coup in Egypt, when they recounted some of their conversations. Maybe these conversations and these recollections are perhaps a little self-serving, but where they stressed the kind of need for compromise in a way that could have sustained civilian-led politics. And we actually did see this in practice by the Nahda party in Tunisia. For whatever criticisms we can make of the results of Tunisian democracy so far, what they have preserved is political contestation and the possibility for change, right? I mean, Tunisia, it's hard to argue that things are working out particularly well. I mean, particularly if we look at the circumstances now, and if you look at the economic situation in Tunisia, but they've preserved the possibility of near-term non-violent change. That's not nothing. And it came down to very important and judicious decisions. Again, structural factors are different. Scale is different. Tunisia is a small place. It is not 100 million people plus like Egypt is now. But it could have gone quite differently. And various people in Tunisia at various junctures made decisions not to succumb to the zero-sum game in which it was all or nothing. Compromise was made, concessions were made, and I think I've talked to some Tunisian political leaders who said, we also thought that if we didn't do this, we would be back in jail in short order, and we wanted to keep this process going, partly out of self-interest, but also because we didn't want it to end in failure. And so I think it's an example of individual institutions and leaders. And of course, Tunisia has a strong union history, quite different, again, in many ways in terms of the kind of breadth of political actors represented along the spectrum. There aren't secularists in the sense that Tunisia has in Egypt. They don't exist in the same way. But nonetheless, these people made decisions that produced maybe suboptimal outcomes, but not disastrous ones. And so, I don't think, again, structural factors are important, but I think it's too much to say that people are doomed to authoritarianism, because I don't think that's the case.
Michael, I'm wondering what you would say about this argument. So I took Dr. Seymour to be asking, tell me the voluntaristic, agent-centric story by which Iraq or Syria ends up differently from the way that it did, right? And the story I would tell might not be the one you would tell. So I'm interested in the story I would tell is that actually Syria could have ended up very differently. People could have made different decisions that would have resulted in a different outcome. The people I'm mainly referring to are the Americans. So when Bashar al-Assad in February 2012 does his constitutional referendum, which legalizes political parties, imposes term limits on the presidency, etc., the Americans and their allies say this is a farce. And I think it was Hillary Clinton at the time who said there is no place for Bashar al-Assad in Syria's future. And you couple that with the behavior of the American ambassador in Syria, who was attending protests, and you did two things. You, first of all, convinced the Syrians that the United States was not actually going to allow that your regime, you convinced the dominant regime that the United States is not going to allow you to have a future in Syria, and so you've got to fight to the death. And you convince the opposition that America has your back, and they might in fact with just a little bit more nudging, and if the opposition proves its mettle and is spunky enough, we might get something like Operation Unified Protector, which brought about the end of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. And so had the United States not done that, and the United States said, hey, you know what, Bashar, that constitutional referendum of yours ain't perfect, but it's a good starting point for negotiation. People should sit down at the negotiating table. We might have actually ended up with a broadened dictatorship in Syria. That, to me, is a voluntaristic argument. It's one that I think you would have a hard time accepting only because it gives the U.S. such a prominent role. But tell me, what's the mistake in that story?
No, I mean, I mean, it's not that I would reject that story outright. I think the failure, the way I thought about it at the time and since, and I think America's failure with respect to Syria was first and foremost an analytical failure, and that is to say that at that moment, there's protests and people, begin mobilizing in Syria. And the story in the region is this is the time of mass mobilization. I don't say Arab Spring, I say Arab uprisings. But anyway, the Arab Spring has taken root. And President Obama can go out and say, there's no future for Bashar al-Assad and Assad must go. And the reason he can say that is because many people collectively made an analytical failure, which was that Bashar al-Assad was going, right? That the Arab uprisings were going in one direction, and this was it, that the despots were going to fall. And in saying those words, they weren't said with a kind of corresponding level of commitment to making that happen. I mean, I think that's the way that they were later interpreted, to say, you, the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, have said that Assad must go. He hasn't gone yet, and so hence, right, like we can fill in the blanks. And so there is that analytical failure at the front end. And I remember, in the summer, talking to someone saying, like, Syria is different in the summer of 2011, as this looks like it is heading to something that looks like civil conflict, to say that, this isn't Egypt. It's a different place, and that, it's going to look different for a variety of reasons. But I do think if analytically in spring of 2011, we begin to see these massive defections in the military, et cetera. And so people were carried away in their analysis. And I think if that analytical process had looked different, and if there was a sense then that they would fight to the death effectively, that, one of the things that I found interesting in Syria, Obama policy, the Obama administration's policy in Syria throughout was not regime change. Once it became involved in various kinds of support to the opposition, but it was an effort to calibrate military force indirectly to change the political calculus of the regime, to try to force them to the negotiating table. And of course, the thing that never changed for the regime was their political calculus. The Russians and the Iranians at various points thought that Assad was about to fall. And it didn't matter in terms of Assad's approach to the opposition. And this was the thing that I found startling. The Assad regime was going to either collapse fighting for its survival, or it was going to win fighting for its survival. And no amount of calibrated political force was going to change that approach. And that's something that I didn't quite get at the outset. I believed that they would fight, but I didn't quite get that how unrelenting their desire to keep hold of power would be. Fears among the military and the Alawite community about what a removal of Assad would mean, not because of any love of the man, but just simply fear about potential collapse. And so again, these existential stakes meant that, trying to calibrate policy in that way was a failure. But again, I think it all flows from that initial analytical failure, a kind of poverty of imagination to imagine what could happen, and the assumption that Assad was going to go. So of course, if the United States had taken a different path, if the Russians had taken a different path, I think some of this goes back to what preceded it in Libya. I think the abuse of the UN Security Council mandate in Libya, I think, is something that we should think long and hard about. Not the actual initial no-fly zone surrounding Benghazi, but the clear abuse of that mandate to then become tantamount to regime change. That's not just a U.S. Action. That's a French, British, Qatari, Emirati action as well. But I think it did a lot to poison the well with the Russians. Not that the Russians would have been willing participants in political negotiations in Syria, but it clearly hardened their position, long-standing about non-interference and sovereignty. But all of this to say, it's a complex story to tell in Syria. But again, things happened very early on in Libya with respect to what the United States believed was getting ready to happen in Syria, that put the country on a pretty disastrous course.
Yeah. No, I mean, the one thing I might say, and we'll probably have to have this bit of the conversation later, but one way you could frame the analytic failure you described is an unwarranted faith in agency and in sufficient attention to structure. That, in other words, had you correctly read the structural tea leaves in Syria, you would have known that there's no real alternative. That's one way to frame it, and we could have that debate. I do want to get two questions from the audience. The next question I have is from Aya Hijazi. I need to unmute her, sorry. Yes, hold on. Ask to unmute. Okay, you should be able to unmute now. Let's try again. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yallah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, good to see you again. My first question is very specific, and it's what would have happened if Shafiq had won? Do you think it would have set Egypt on a different trajectory? And the second is, in an ideal world, what would you like the US to do? So obviously it's not the conditionality in Egypt, but what would you like to see the US do? Is that enough? I think that's enough.
No, that's great. And just so everybody knows, Ahmed Shafiq was the former Air Force and chief and Minister of Civil Aviation, who was very close to Mubarak, who ran for president and almost won in 2012. He lost, of course, to the ill-fated Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. So go ahead. Actually, Michael, if we might, just in the interest of time, what if I gathered one more question and then you could, okay. So the next question I will come to is from Ghadir Kunna.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Mr. Hanna. I'm Sudanese, so Sudanese American, so I'm obviously interested in the part that you mentioned about Sudan. We had a discussion last week. We hosted actually the Sudanese ambassador to the United States here in one of the talks in the Arab Caucus. And one of the questions I actually was interested in, why are we, one of the biggest problems about the massacre that happened in the revolution in Sudan is we still have people who actually participated and actually were the cause behind the massacre who are in the current government. And one of the things that everybody's asking in Sudan is for people to move forward, for the civilian rule, which we're still waiting to happen, the transition, is we're saying what's happening about these people coming, they need to be held answerable to their actions. And why are they a part of this revolution? And his answer was, we will never really get rid of them. The people are going to have to decide moving forward, is there going to be a new country? Or are we going to revert to what happened? Knowing that we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood back in place, but make no mistake, they're still strangling the country moving forward. They may not be in the current regime. We have the army, but the army is also part of the Muslim Brotherhood. My question to you is, how do we resolve this standstill where we need recognition of the massacres that happened? People are still demanding. I mean, you know, one of the logos they went on was, the slogan was "Ad-dam bid-dam," blood for blood. There is going to be no other way out of it. But yet the country needs to move forward. What would your recommendation be?
Great. So,
Yeah.
so just to recap the three questions. So Aya's questions were, could Egypt have ended up differently had Ahmed Shafi, the Mubarak crony, won in 2012? What should the Biden administration do? And then Ghadir's question about how, and this is a general question, what do you do with ancien regimes that have real blood on their hands in these situations of transition?
Yeah, so I think it is interesting to see the ways in which I think the Egyptian military misplayed the election. They didn't necessarily coalesce around a candidate. And part of that was, quite, if we talk about agency, Tantawi and Amr Musa famously did not get along or like each other. I think, a kind of compromise candidate like Amr Musa would have served Egypt better than Ahmed Shafi or Mohamed Morsi. And as a kind of transition figure, one who wouldn't necessarily, trigger the kinds of suspicions that both of these other men, Shafi and Morsi, did for obvious reasons. I think looking at the ways in which the Sisi regime has since treated Ahmed Shafi, they clearly don't see him as a man of the new regime. And it speaks to the ways in which, contemporary Egypt is quite different than Mubarak's Egypt, right? So, if we think back, Nasser's Egypt at the, when really post 56, Egypt is a military regime. If we, harkens back to Anwar Abdel Malik and the way he talked about, Egypt as a military state, and that overbearing military presence, where more than half of the cabinet ministers were military officers, changes over time as the presidency becomes personalized, and this accelerates under Anwar al-Sadat, and even more so in the Mubarak era as the full effect of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty takes hold, as the military, recedes further, and then, has different kinds of competitors in, post-Infitah with businessmen, and this accelerates in the kind of era of privatization in the Mubarak era, and the rise of the Ministry of Interior. So all of that is to say that the state changes quite dramatically from the 50s to really 2011, and it's changed a lot since. And Ahmed Shafi at the time was seen as a kind of part and parcel of the old regime, but Sisi's Egypt is not the old regime. It is a different regime, and a kind of where hierarchies are different, where military intelligence now is the kind of has become the heart of the regime. There have been purges at general intelligence. Anyway, all that is to say that it's probably a mistake to see Ahmed Shafi as a kind of direct link with what has emerged since. He's clearly viewed with suspicion because the new regime isn't simply the old regime. What would have happened? I think perhaps the transition would have been more sustainable with a division of power. I think one of the things that the Brotherhood overestimated was their own popularity and how much that popularity could propel them forward, and that led to them to some really fateful decisions, like the kind of frontal battle with the military, right? I mean, which we can now see as suicidal and really quite crazy. They believed, and this links up a little bit to my answer to the question about Sudan, but they believed that they could take on the military and win simply by force of their popular appeal and their constituencies in the street. And they badly misread where Egypt was going. They overestimated what their weight was in Egyptian society. And of course, they picked the worst battle that they could. But it was a kind of total roll of the dice that prioritized the coherence of the organization as well. They believed that to lose as the Brotherhood, fighting, that would preserve the coherence of the organization and its unity going forward was a better bet than compromising and potentially losing face with members of the Brotherhood. But obviously, it was a fateful and terrible decision, not just for the brothers, but for Egypt. And yeah, I mean, could it have been any worse? Probably not, right? So it might have been a little bit better. Obviously, Shafiq is not a reformist, but maybe it would have forestalled the kind of worst case scenarios that we've seen since. In terms of U.S.-Egypt, I mean, I've written a lot about this. I don't think the relationship makes any sense. I think it is a function of path dependence. Again, so, did it make sense to restructure the relationship in the 70s and 80s after the October War? Yeah, of course it did. It was a major realignment in the midst of the Cold War. It neutralized one of the most, serious fault lines for potential instability in terms of taking Egypt and Israel off of the battlefield effectively, and shoring up that bilateral relationship with military assistance made a lot of sense. It might have even made sense when in the 90s during the Clinton administration, when it looked as if there was an actual peace process and a potential for a two-state solution, and Egypt was seen as important to that process. Maybe even in the early, in the 90s, when global terrorism becomes an issue and Egypt is seen as an important counterterrorism partner. But those animating rationales for the relationship don't really hold anymore. And the Egypt-Israel relationship exists for its own reasons and out of self-interest on all sides. It is not being propped up by the United States. We don't have a particularly close relationship with Egypt. It is one marked by suspicion. If we look at the ways in which the Egyptian security sector talks about the United States, even the United States' role in 2011, and the belief that this was somehow a US-inspired, effectively color revolution kind of thing, you have to wonder what exactly is this military relationship? What is it for? And that's an open question to me. And so I've advocated for many years now to restructure the relationship. I think it's not, it is not a deep strategic relationship, and Egypt is not the Egypt of old. The Arab state system, which was once dominated by Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Saudi, that's something that doesn't exist now. And Egypt is not the consequential political player on the regional front that it used to be. So, I think we have to re-examine, and I think it's time for that. So in terms of Sudan, again, even in 2011 and 2012, when talking to various activists about the military, one of the things that one of the things I highlighted at the time was that civilian control of the military in Egypt is not the first place you start in transition. It's the last. It's the kind of it's the kind of thing that can only happen after a consolidation of democracy, a consolidation of civilian rule, the strengthening of institutions. And it's the kind of last point when you then have civilians overseeing and controlling a transparent military budget, right? And this was a mistake that Mohammed Morsi and the brothers made too. They picked this fight with the military. I always saw it as the last stage of transition, not the first, right? I mean, this institution that has played this predominant role in Egypt, whose role had grown in the transition period. It was always fanciful to imagine that these nascent civilian institutions with little traction, we're going to put the military in their place effectively. And so I saw this as the last point of a transition as opposed to the first. And that seems very unsatisfying, but I think maybe realistic. And I would imagine in many ways there could be similar themes to draw out of that for Sudan. The military is a very powerful institution. It remains a powerful institution during this kind of fraught transition. The military is not going to willingly give up all its power and make itself accountable to civilians out of the goodness of its heart. It's just not going to happen. And the only way that it can happen is if this political transition takes root, if the transition is able to consolidate and take on kind of its own momentum going forward. It's at a later stage, I imagine, that questions like accountability and the relationship of civilians to the military can be litigated at a kind of very deep and substantive level. So not the first stage of a transition, but a much later one.
All right. So we are now at the end of our time, and I just want to, on behalf of our audience, thank today's speaker, Michael Hanna, for just a really tremendous talk. I mean, the depth of knowledge, the insight, the clarity is just really refreshing. I will also say that, you managed to combine two qualities that you don't often find going together, which is, you are very much in the voluntaristic camp, and yet you are not an optimist. And usually I find the Pollyanna-ish testimonials to a bright Arab future, the Arab Spring is a process, we're only done with round one. That is the kind of pose adopted by the voluntarist. And so you are a pessimistic voluntarist, which I think is actually a refreshing perspective. So thank you for this, giving us a lot of food for thought. I just want to note for everybody, thank you again for joining us. I hope you'll join us next week on Thursday, April 15th at 1:30 p.m. We'll continue this conversation. We'll be joined by Professor Elizabeth Nugent of Yale University, who will speak about her new book, After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition. And she, I think, like Mr. Hanna, is a voluntarist, and we'll talk about certain features of the kind of political landscapes that led to some of the decisions that Mr. Hanna outlined today. Again, Michael, thank you. This was really great, and I hope we'll have you back very soon.
Be great. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.